She had come 2,000 miles to marry a stranger. 14 days later, he beat her half to death and threw her into the mud of the main street while 60 men watched and not one stepped forward. She was closing her eyes to die when two shadows rose against the afternoon sun, taller than shadows ought to be. And a voice every soul in Oak Haven would remember said, "Step away from the Lady Rourke. Step away now." This is the story of the Boston girl they left in the dirt and the mountain man who came down off his silence to carry her home. The mud was the first thing she tasted. Cold copper bright mud mixed with the iron tang of her own blood pressed into her mouth when her face struck the frozen street of Oak Haven, Colorado. October 1883. Josephine Ashmore was 21 years old and she was going to die in a street she had only walked for 2 weeks. She had come 2,000 miles for this. A boot caught her in the ribs. She heard the crack before she felt it, that sickening sound of bone giving way under leather and spite. And then the pain bloomed through her side like a wildfire finding dry grass. She could not draw breath to scream. She could only taste the mud in the blood, in the strange, sweet rot of the street where miners had spat tobacco and horses had passed for 20 years. Above her, Clayton Rourke was shouting something. She could not make out the words. Her ears had filled with a high, thin ringing like church bells heard from underwater. She saw his mouth moving. She saw the crowd behind him, 50 men, maybe 60, a wall of bearded faces and shadowed hats, and not one of them stepping forward. Not one. She had traveled 2,000 miles for this moment, to die alone in the street while 60 men watched. Her vision darkened at the edges. The ringing in her ears grew louder. And then at the far end of the street, against the hard slant of the afternoon sun, two shadows rose up that were taller than shadows ought to be. Two men built like the mountains themselves coming down the boardwalk in no particular hurry. The crowd parted for them the way water parts for a stone. A voice when it came was low and quiet pitched so that every man in the street could hear it without being raised. "Step away from the Lady Rourke. Step away now." Clayton Rourke turned, and for the first time in 2 weeks, Josephine Ashmore saw fear flicker across his face. Before we go on, if this is your first time here, take a moment and hit that subscribe button. Every week, I share a new frontier tale stories of the men who carved their lives out of stone and snow, and the women brave enough to love them. And while you are here, let me know in the comments where you are listening from tonight. I read every one. Now come back with me to a Boston that was already dying and a girl who did not yet know she was being delivered to a monster. 6 months before that street in Oak Haven, Josephine Ashmore had stood in a parlor in Beacon Hill with the sheets drawn over the furniture like shrouds. Her father, Thomas Ashmore, had died on a Tuesday in April, his heart stopping in the middle of a sentence about spring shipping schedules. His shipping firm had failed 4 months before that 2 cargo vessels lost in a February gale off Nantucket, and the creditors had come like ravens to a battlefield. Her mother had been gone 9 years, carried off by fever the winter Josephine turned 12. And now her father was in the ground, and the house she had been born in belonged to the bank, and her Ashmore cousins in Providence had sent back her letters unopened. She had $40 in her reticule and her mother's cameo brooch at her throat. That was what she had in the world. Josephine had been raised in the old way. She spoke French and a little German. She played Chopin and Mendelssohn on the piano. She could set a table for 12, embroider a handkerchief, write a letter in a hand that would have done credit to a queen. She had never walked alone with a man who was not her father. She had never been kissed. She had never been spoken to by anyone, man or woman, who did not already know who her grandfather had been. She was, in the parlance of the age, a perfect lady, and in the spring of 1883, she discovered that a perfect lady was a thing the world no longer had any use for. The advertisement in the National Police Gazette had been folded and unfolded so many times the paper had worn soft as cloth. Strong woman needed, mountain homestead, hard life, fair man. The man who answered her inquiry was named Clayton Rourke of Oak Haven, Colorado territory. His letters came every 10 days through the summer of '83, and they were beautiful. He wrote of a cattle ranch spread beneath snow-capped peaks, He wrote of a timber house with 3 stone chimneys and a veranda that looked east toward the plains. He wrote of a woman's touch wanted and of respect and of quiet evenings. He wrote as if he had read every book she had ever loved. He used the word cherish. She read those letters by candlelight in the back room of a boarding house in the North End, where she had gone to live after the creditors took the Beacon Hill house. She read them and wept and wrote back and sent a daguerreotype of herself taken 3 years before her father's death. She told him she was not afraid of hard work. She told him she could cook and clean and play the piano of an evening. She told him she would come. She did not know that the letters had been written by a drunken clerk named Henniker, who copied his phrases from a pocket edition of Longfellow. She did not know that Clayton Rourke could barely sign his own name. She boarded the train at South Station on the 17th of September, 1883. A porter carried her trunk. She wore a traveling dress of navy blue wool with small lace details at the collar and cuffs, and her mother's cameo pinned at her throat, and her honey-colored hair pinned up in the style her mother had taught her. She looked out the window as Boston slid away behind her, the city of her childhood, the city that had buried her father and forgotten her name. She did not cry. She had done all her crying already. Chicago was a confusion of smoke and coal dust and shouted languages she did not speak. St. Louis was worse. By the time she reached Denver on the 5th of October, she had not slept in a proper bed for 11 days, and the prairies had worn the softness out of her face the way wind wears softness out of stone. It was on the stagecoach from Denver, rattling southwest toward Oak Haven, along a road that was more suggestion than road, that she met the widow Agnes Whitaker. The old woman was traveling to Silver Cliff to winter with her son. She wore black bombazine and a widow's bonnet and smelled of lavender and peppermint. She took one look at Josephine at the cameo and the navy dress and the Boston hands, and her old eyes grew sad. "Child," she said, "where are you bound?" "Oak Haven, ma'am. I am to be married there." "To whom, if I may ask?" "A Mr. Clayton Rourke. He has a cattle ranch." The widow was quiet for a long mile. Then she reached across and took Josephine's hand in both of her own, and her hands were small and cold and strong as roots. "Listen to me, child. I do not know this Mr. Rourke, but I know Oak Haven. And Oak Haven is no place for a Boston girl. It is a silver camp. The only ranch in 50 miles is a played-out cow operation run by a Mormon family up the North Fork, and they have 6 sons of their own." She pressed something into Josephine's palm. A handkerchief, white linen embroidered with the initial. "If anything at all goes wrong, you run. You do not run down the valley. You run up the mountain. There are good men up there, the Ridge brothers, Silas and Ephraim. You ask anyone from Silver Cliff to Oak Haven, and they will tell you where to find them. Do you understand me? Child, up the mountain, never down the valley." Josephine had smiled politely and folded the handkerchief into her sleeve. She had thought the old woman was simply frightened of the frontier. She had thought many things that afternoon that she would come to remember as the last foolish thoughts of her girlhood. The stagecoach rounded the final bend 3 hours before sundown. Oak Haven lay in the valley below like a wound on the flank of the mountain. There was no cattle ranch. There was no veranda looking east. There was a single muddy street flanked by 20 unpainted buildings, a silver mill smoking sour yellow smoke into the cold sky, and a great timber building at the center of the town with a sign that read, "The Silver Keg Saloon," in letters that had once been read. Clayton Rourke was waiting for her on the boardwalk in front of the saloon. He was broad-shouldered and thick through the middle, with hair that he had oiled flat against his skull and eyes like chipped flint, and he was nothing. Nothing at all like the man who had written those letters. "Miss Ashmore," he said, and spat tobacco juice onto the boards beside him. "Right on time, preacher's waiting." The wedding took 15 minutes. It took place in the back room of the assayer's office before a circuit preacher who smelled of whiskey and could not look her in the eye, with 2 bored witnesses who turned out to be 2 of Clayton's saloon girls pressed into service. There was no ring, there was no music, there was no veil. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Clayton Rourke did not kiss her. He took her by the elbow, hard enough to leave a mark, and he walked her across the street to the Silver Keg and up the back stairs to a pair of rooms above the saloon that smelled of tobacco and stale beer, and he shut the door behind them. "Here's how this works, Mrs. Rourke," he said. "You cook, you clean, you smile pretty when the assayer and the preacher come for Sunday supper. You are my wife on paper and in front of the town. That is what you are for. You are never ever to come down into my saloon. You are never to touch my desk. You are never to speak when I have not asked you to speak. You do that, and you and I will get along fine. You understand me?" She had nodded because she did not trust her voice. "One more thing, I do not need a wife in the other way. I have the girls downstairs for that. You understand what I am saying to you? You are a piece of furniture with a pretty face. Do not flatter yourself otherwise." He had left her there in a room with a bed she would never share with him, and a small window that looked out over the muddy street, and she had stood for a long time in her navy traveling dress, with the dust of 2,000 miles still on her hem, and she had understood at last what the widow on the stagecoach had been trying to tell her. The next morning he brought her bread and cold bacon and a pail of water for washing, and she began the first of the 14 days that were to teach her what hell was made of. She learned quickly. She learned that the saloon girls downstairs, 3 young women who looked at her with a combination of pity and contempt, were something Clayton called his real assets, and that his real business was not the bar at all, but what happened in the rooms behind it and in the counting room where he did not permit her to set foot. She learned that the town's deputy, a bald man named Miller with a red nose and a gold tooth, was on Clayton's payroll. She learned that the circuit judge down in Denver, a man named Howlett, was on Clayton's payroll. She learned that when Clayton came upstairs drunk and found some small thing not to his satisfaction, a plate set wrong, a shirt not pressed, he would slap her across the mouth so hard her teeth would cut the inside of her cheek. And then he would say, in the same voice his letters had used, cherish you, as if the word were a brand. He was burning into her. On the 9th day, while Clayton was downstairs, she found the ledger. It was in a shallow drawer beneath his desk, hidden under a false panel she discovered only because she had been dusting the underside of the desk looking for spider webs. A ledger bound in brown leather, the corners worn soft with use. She opened it, and for a long minute she could not make sense of the number she was looking at. The amounts were too large. Thousands upon thousands of dollars month after month coming in from something called W-Claim, something called Widowmaker. She was a Boston girl. She had helped her father with his books from the time she was 14. She knew what she was looking at within 3 minutes. Clayton Rourke was not a saloon keeper. Clayton Rourke was running a silver mine in secret, and whoever had owned it before him, a man named Ezra Calloway, whose name appeared in the ledger with the words settled beside it in a handwriting she would come to hate, was no longer alive to complain. There was a list of other names too, 9 of them, each with settled written beside it. 9 men who had at one time or another gotten in Clayton Rourke's way. She closed the ledger. She put it back exactly as she had found it, and then she began very quietly to plan. On the 13th day, she found the other thing, a yellowed envelope at the very back of the same drawer addressed to her father's firm from a Boston attorney. Inside a deed, a parcel of land in Lexington, Massachusetts, 42 acres, held in trust for Josephine Ashmore upon her coming of age. Her father had never told her. The land had been her mother's dowry, and her father had kept it hidden from the creditors. And now here it was in Clayton Rourke's drawer, and beneath it folded a letter drafted in Clayton's own crude hand with her signature forged at the bottom, transferring the entire parcel to him. She did not know why she cried then, and not in any of the days before. Perhaps because the land meant her father had loved her, had been trying to protect her all along. Perhaps because the forged signature meant Clayton had never intended to let her live long enough to read it. She heard his boot on the stair. She had only time to slide the ledger into the lining of her trunk behind the winter petticoats before the door opened. He saw her face. He knew. She had never been able to lie with her face. "What were you at in my desk?" "Nothing, I was not." "You were." He crossed the room in 2 steps, and she did not have time to run. What happened next happened in pieces the way terrible things always happen. His hand in her hair, the pain of her scalp coming loose from her skull. His voice shouting about the girl downstairs, about the saloon, about the town. You think you're better than this dirt, you Boston piece of glass. Her feet stumbling on the stairs, the sound of a piano somewhere going wrong mid-phrase as the room below went silent. The swinging doors of the silver keg banging open. 60 pairs of eyes looking up from whiskey and cards. The cold shock of the street as she was flung through the doors and off the boardwalk. And then the mud, and the blood, and the boot. She is a thief, Clayton Rourke was shouting to the crowd, to the empty windows, to the God he did not believe in. She is a thief and a harlot. No man touches her. No woman helps her. She lies there till the buzzards come. You hear me? She lies there, or the man who helps her answers to me. Deputy Miller lit a cigar on the opposite boardwalk and looked at the sky as if he had never seen it before. From the windows of the boarding house across the way, women watched with their hands pressed to their mouths. The doors stayed shut. And Josephine Ashmore, who was 21 years old and had come 2,000 miles on a promise and a lie, closed her eyes in the freezing mud and prepared to die. Silas Ridge did not belong in Oak Haven. He came down off the mountain twice a year in April and October, and he did not come for company. He came for salt and coffee and powder and .44 cartridges for the Winchesters he and his brother kept, and for the few books his brother Ephraim ordered by post through Henderson's general store. That was all. He stayed a single night in the room Henderson kept above the store for him, and he was gone by dawn. He was 34 years old that October. He stood 6 feet and 6 inches in his socks, and he weighed 230 pounds that had been shaped by 20 years of splitting cordwood and packing elk quarters across ridge lines no horse would attempt. His hair was the color of dark honey, streaked paler by 10,000 days of high country sun, and his beard was thick and trimmed close, and his eyes were the color of amber held up to firelight. He wore a bearskin coat he had taken off the back of the bear who had made it, and the coat had been with him 9 winters, and it showed. He had buried his wife Martha 10 years before that day in a cholera yard outside St. Louis after begging 5 doctors in rich houses to come down into the poor ward, and each of them had closed his door in his face. Silas Ridge had left St. Louis with her grave still wet, and he had ridden west until the mountains rose up to meet him, and he had not gone back. He had not loved a living woman in the decades since. He had not expected to. He had the mountain and his brother, and that was enough for a man who had learned that the world only breaks what it cannot own. His brother Ephraim was 3 years younger, 2 inches shorter, and in every way more of their mother. Where Silas was silence, Ephraim was the slow, quiet music of someone thinking out loud. Ephraim built the furniture and mended the harness and kept the books their father had left them, 200 volumes of Emerson and Shakespeare and Gibbon and Sir Walter Scott. Ephraim had a long white scar down his left cheek from the afternoon he had freed a bear cub from a trapper's snare, and the cub's mother had not understood what he was doing. Ephraim was the one who remembered to smile. They had been orphaned in 1862 when an influenza came up the valley and took their father Nathaniel and their mother Rebecca within a single week. Silas had been 13, Ephraim had been 10. No neighbor had come for them. They had buried their parents under the big ponderosa pine behind the cabin, and they had kept the fire lit, and they had survived the first winter on their own, and the one after that, and they had kept surviving for 21 years, and they had built a life on a mountain called Ridge Hollow that asked nothing of the world and gave nothing back. That October afternoon, they had finished their trading at Henderson's by 3:30, and Ephraim had gone back inside to pick up a parcel of books he had waited 4 months for. Silas was tightening the pack on the lead mule when the shouting began down the street. He watched a woman thrown from the doors of the silver keg like a sack of trash. He watched her land in the mud. He watched the boot find her ribs. He watched 60 men look at their boots. Something old and buried moved in Silas Ridge's chest. Something that had been asleep for 10 years. Ephraim came out of the store with his parcel of books wrapped in twine. He looked at his brother's face, and he looked down the street, and he set the parcel, carefully on the wagon seat. "Silas," he said, "I see it. You know what will come of this." "I know." "Then let us go." They walked down the middle of the street. Not fast. Silas had never moved fast in his life. They walked the way weather moves, the way winter comes in October, inevitable and without hurry. The crowd in front of the silver keg saw them coming and began, not all at once, but one by one, to remember pressing business elsewhere. Clayton Rourke had his foot drawn back for another blow, and he did not see them until the street around him had emptied of everyone but Deputy Miller. Then he turned. Silas Ridge stopped 6 feet from him. Ephraim stopped a pace behind and to his brother's left, where the mountain men had been taught to stand by their father when they were still boys. One brother to lead, one brother to guard. 2 rifles, 2 fields of fire. "Step away from the Lady Rourke. Step away now." Clayton Rourke's mouth opened and closed twice before anything came out. "This is town business, Ridge, not mountain business. She is my wife. You hear me, my wife. My property." "A woman is not property," Silas Ridge said in a voice that carried the way a rifle shot carries in cold air. "And a man who strikes one is less than dirt. Step back, Rourke. Last time. You touch her, and I will have you hanged." "By which judge?" Clayton Rourke looked at Deputy Miller. Deputy Miller was now looking at a point in the sky roughly above the silver mill, as if he had been painted onto the boardwalk and could not be addressed. Ephraim moved then very slowly around his brother's left side, and he knelt in the mud beside the woman lying there. He did it the way he had once knelt beside a half-grown fawn with its leg in a fence. He did not touch her. He let her see his hands, first palms open empty. "Ma'am, my name is Ephraim Ridge. My brother and I are going to get you out of this street. Can you hear me, ma'am? Nod if you can hear me." Her eyes, swollen, almost shut open. She looked at the enormous shape of him, and he watched understanding come slowly back into her face. She nodded once. "Good. That is good. Can you tell me your name?" She tried. Her voice came out as a rasp. Her lip was split, and the blood had dried there. She tried again. "Josephine Ashmore, not Rourke." Something moved across Ephraim Ridge's face, and he said very softly, "Ashmore it is, Miss Ashmore. Ashmore it is." Clayton Rourke went for the revolver at his hip. He got his hand onto the grip, and he had even begun to lift it when he found himself looking into the muzzle of Silas Ridge's Colt Peacemaker. He had not seen Silas move. He never did see Silas move, not really in all the years of his life that were left to him, which were considerably fewer than he was about to assume. "Let go of the iron, Rourke. Ridge, you mountain. Let go of the iron, or I will take your hand off at the wrist and give it back to you. You want to die in the street? You look at me and you tell me if you think I am joking." Clayton Rourke looked at Silas Ridge. He let go of the iron. It dropped into the mud with a small, wet sound that nobody in Oak Haven would ever forget. "Ephraim, I have her, Silas." Ephraim lifted Josephine Ashmore out of the mud the way a man lifts a child from deep water. She was lighter than he had expected. She weighed, he thought, not much more than one of his winter hides. He carried her to his brother's horse, and Silas took her from him and settled her across the saddle and swung up behind her in one motion, and she felt the great warm barrel of him at her back, and she felt an arm across her hips that was strong enough to hold her there without crushing her, and she thought quite clearly, and for the first time in 3 weeks, that she was not going to die today. Silas looked down at Clayton Rourke where he stood pressing a bleeding hand to his coat, and he looked at Deputy Miller on the opposite boardwalk and at the silent town behind them. And his voice, when it came, was not loud, but every soul in Oak Haven heard it. "This woman rides with us tonight. She is under my protection and my brother's roof from this hour forward. I do not know what she has taken from you, Rourke, or what you think she owes you. I do not care. You send men up that mountain and they do not come back. You come yourself, and I am telling you now, before this whole town is witness, that you do not come back either. I do not make promises I cannot keep. That is one." He looked at Deputy Miller. "Miller, You looked at the sky when a woman was being killed in your street. I will remember that. A man keeps his word, or he is not a man. You think on that tonight." He reined his horse around. Ephraim mounted his own beside him. They rode down the street of Oak Haven in the long slanting light of the October afternoon, and the town watched them go and no one followed. Clayton Rourke stood in the mud with his ruined hand pressed to his coat until their backs were small against the lower switchbacks of the mountain. Then he turned white with rage and something colder than rage, and he spat into the street. "Miller." "Yes, Mr. Rourke." "Wire Leadville. I want the Bannon brothers on the first stage. Tell them the fee is doubled. Tell them I want the woman back, and I want those 2 ridges in the ground before the first snow." "Yes, Mr. Rourke." And Miller. "Yes, Mr. Rourke. If she talked, if she knows what is in that ledger, if she got out of those rooms with anything in her hands, then every man whose name is in that book hangs, including yours. You understand what I am telling you?" Deputy Miller understood. High above them on the first of the switchbacks that wound up to Ridge Hollow, Josephine Ashmore rode pressed against the warm, solid weight of a man whose name she had only just learned. She did not know where she was being taken. She did not know whether she had been saved or simply traded to a different owner. She knew only that his arm was steady at her waist and that his heartbeat was slow and even against her back, the way a deep river runs slow and even beneath ice, and that she could breathe, and that for the first time in 14 days, the taste in her mouth was not fear. The sun went down behind the peaks, and the world turned to blue shadow, and the air grew bitter cold, and somewhere far above them, she heard a wolf call, and a second wolf answer it from a ridge she could not see. She pressed her face very carefully against the rough wool of Silas Ridge's coat, and she closed her eyes. She did not know it yet, but she was riding into the only real life she would ever have. She did not know that the brown leather ledger was still sewn into the lining of her trunk, which was still in the room above the silver keg, and that by morning Clayton Rourke would have discovered it and would know that he was already a dead man walking. She did not know that a telegraph operator in Leadville at that very moment was tapping out a message to 3 brothers who killed men for money. She did not know that the widow Agnes Whitaker had been right about the mountain and wrong about only one thing. There were not merely good men up there. There was home. She did not know any of it. All she knew was that somewhere above her in the dark, a pine limb brushed the shoulder of the man she was riding with, and he turned his head slightly so that it would not strike her face. Such a small thing. Such a small, small kindness after 14 days of such great cruelty. She began very quietly without making a sound to cry. Silas Ridge did not speak. He felt her shoulders shake once against his chest. He tightened his arm a fraction at her waist. That was all. He had spent 10 years not speaking to a grieving woman. He knew, as few men ever know, that there were moments when speech was the enemy of comfort, and that what a wounded thing needed most was simply to be carried. He rode on into the dark, his brother a pace behind him, the great soft silence of the Sangre de Cristo mountains closing around them, and he did not know yet that his heart, which he had buried in a cholera yard 1,000 miles behind him, had just that afternoon begun to beat again. Winter was coming. Winter always comes. But a man keeps his word, and the lady he had pulled out of the mud was under his rua now. And so he rode on through the dark, up the mountain, toward the cabin his father had built in 1861, and toward everything that was about to happen there. She woke in a bed she did not know, in a room that smelled of wood smoke and pine, and the faint, sweet scent of tallow candles that had been burned and then snowbound while she slept. For a long moment she did not move. She did not open her eyes past the thinnest slit. 2 weeks in Oak Haven had taught her that waking in a strange place was something you did with great care learning. First, what had changed while you were unconscious before the world could use your own waking against you? She heard a fire. Soft, steady, well-tended. She heard the scratch of a pen on paper, slow and patient, the way a man writes when he is thinking between every word. She heard wind outside and a deeper silence behind the wind that was unlike any silence she had ever known in a city. She opened her eyes. The room was small and warm and clean. The walls were peeled pine logs darkened by 30 years of cooking smoke to the color of honey. A single window frost rimmed at the corners showed her a flat sheet of pale water beyond the cabin, a frozen lake surrounded by black spruce, and the first snow line of the high peaks beyond. The bed beneath her was piled with wolf pelts in a thick wool blanket the color of cream. Somebody had taken her navy dress off her gently and had left her in a man's flannel shirt that reached her knees and that smelled of cedar and clean soap. Her ribs were wrapped tight with clean linen. Her cut lip had been salved with something that smelled of honey and beeswax. A man sat at a rough oak table in the corner, writing in a journal with a pencil. She did not remember his name at first. Then it came back to her through the folly of concussion and laudanum. Ephraim, the younger one, the quiet one with the long white scar down his left cheek. He felt her looking and turned slowly, keeping his hands in plain view the way a man does when he does not want to startle a wild thing. He closed the journal and set the pencil down beside it. Miss Ashmore, you are at Ridge Hollow. My brother and I carried you up here from Oak Haven 2 nights ago. You have 3 broken ribs, a mild concussion, and a great many bruises that will take 3 weeks to finish changing color. You are safe here. No one has come up the mountain behind us. May I bring you water? Please, she whispered. Her voice was a stranger. He rose and she saw again how enormous he was, 6 feet and 4 inches of him, and how carefully he moved inside a space that was too small for him. He brought her a tin cup of cold well water and held it for her while she drank because her hands were still shaking too much to be trusted. When she had finished, he set the cup aside and stepped back. My brother is out on the ridge checking a trap line. He will be back before dark. There is broth on the stove when you are hungry. I will not touch you. You will not be touched in this cabin by any hand unless you ask for it. Do you understand what I am telling you, Miss Ashmore? She nodded and she began to cry without meaning to, and he looked away politely and pretended he did not see. Silas came in at dusk. She heard him before she saw the stamp of his boots on the porch as he knocked the snow off them, the careful opening of the door so that the cold would not rush the room, the slow, deliberate hanging of his coat and rifle on the pegs beside the door. Then he filled the doorway between the front room and the bedroom, and she saw him properly for the first time without mud and pain and fear between them. He did not come in. He stood at the threshold with his hat in his hands. Miss Ashmore, Mr. Ridge, Ephraim tells me your ribs are tender but not displaced. That is good news. You will not have to be strapped in any particular position. You should be on your feet in a week, full use of yourself by New Year. I do not know how to thank you. You do not thank me, Miss Ashmore. Thank is not the word for what happened between us in that street. There is no word for it. Put it out of your mind. He turned the hat in his hands once, twice, a gesture he would repeat 1,000 times in her presence in the years to come. I need to speak with you about the arrangement. You do not have to hear me tonight, but when you are able. I am able. He came in then and stood at the foot of the bed, and he spoke in a voice so quiet she had to lean forward to catch it, and what he said was a thing that would, in later years she would understand, had been the actual moment her life began again. This cabin has 1 bedroom and a front room. The bedroom is yours. Mine and Ephraim's bedrolls are in the barn. The barn is tight and warm. We have wintered there before. We will winter there again. You will stay until spring, Miss Ashmore. That is when the pass is open and the stage runs again out of Silver Cliff. If you wish to go back east in April, I will ride you down to Silver Cliff myself, and I will buy you a ticket to any city you name with my own money. You owe me nothing for that. You owe us nothing for any of this. No man is going to put a price on a human life in this cabin. That is not how my father raised us, and that is not how I live. You understand me, Miss Ashmore? Yes. You will be cold some nights. You will be lonely some nights. You will hear things on this mountain that will frighten you. None of them will hurt you. Ephraim and I will see to that. A man keeps his word, Miss Ashmore. That is one promise I make you now. And the second is this: you are safe in this house. You will sleep in this house as you have not slept since your father died. Do you believe me?" She could not speak. She nodded. "That is all I came to say. Ephraim has broth. Eat what you can." He turned to go. "Mr. Ridge?" "Ma'am." "Why?" He stopped at the threshold with his back to her. The fire popped once in the front room. Somewhere outside, a coyote spoke to the rising moon, and a second coyote answered from farther up the hollow. "10 years ago, I had a wife. Her name was Martha. She died in a poor ward in St. Louis because 5 rich men would not open their doors to let a doctor come to her. I stood in that street with her fever on my hands, and I swore to my God that I would never again stand by while the strong broke the weak. When I saw Rourke put his boot to you, I saw those 5 doors. That is all. There is nothing more to it than that. Eat your broth, Miss Ashmore." And he went out, and she lay in the warm bed in the strange cabin on the strange mountain, and she wept, not the way she had wept for 2 weeks, which was the weeping of a trapped thing, but a different weeping, a deeper one, because a stranger had just told her she was worth the weight of a dead wife, and she did not know yet what to do with that. The first week she slept. By the second, she was sitting up by the fire in the front room, wrapped in wool, watching Ephraim knead bread at the big oak table. She learned the rhythms of the cabin the way a person learns a poem without meaning to, by repetition. Silas up at 4:30, feeding the stove, grinding coffee from beans he roasted himself in a cast-iron skillet. Ephraim up at 5, tending the horses and the 6 hens in the lean-to. Breakfast at 6, always the same cornbread bacon, 2 eggs each, black coffee, strong enough to dissolve iron. Silas out by 7 with the sharps across his back sometimes, on snowshoes, sometimes on the big buckskin gelding named Hannibal. Ephraim to his work, which was everything else: the harness and the carpentry and the books and the 1,000 small repairs a high country cabin demanded every day of its life. Noon meal at 12 sharp, afternoon work until full dark, supper, and then the long evening with Ephraim, reading aloud from whatever volume he was currently moving through Emerson one week, Sir Walter Scott the next, his voice soft and deliberate in the firelight, while Silas mended tack with a bone needle and did not speak, but listened. Bed at 9. She had not known before Ridge Hollow that a life could be lived this way. She had thought lives were made of drawing rooms and visiting cards and timetables and appointments. She had not known that a life could be made instead out of weather and work and the quiet shared reading of a book in the long blue northern evening. It astonished her. It shamed her a little for her old self, and then in time it stopped shaming her, and instead she began to feel something she could not yet name, which was the first slow turning of a soul toward its true country. By the end of the second week, she was strong enough to knead her own bread, and by the fourth week, she had taken over the baking entirely because she had a feel for yeast that Ephraim, for all his skill, did not. She did not tell Ephraim this. She simply began to bake, and the first loaf she pulled from the Dutch oven was so beautiful that Ephraim looked at it and then at her and said very dryly, "Miss Ashmore, I am going to read my book now and pretend I did not see that. A man has his pride." She laughed. It was the first time she had laughed since Boston. She clapped a hand to her still tender ribs and laughed anyway because it hurt less than not laughing did. Silas at the woodpile outside heard the sound through the cabin wall and stopped in the middle of swinging the axe, and he stood there for a long time with the axe resting on his shoulder, and he looked up at the peaks, and he did not know he was smiling until his beard moved. The skill lessons began in the 5th week. It was Silas who brought it up on a still morning when new snow had fallen overnight, and the whole hollow lay under a sheet of unbroken white. He laid his revolver on the oak table, the old silver-plated Colt Navy he had carried since Missouri, and he looked at her across it. "Miss Ashmore, if men come up this mountain, I will not always be standing in front of you. Ephraim will not always be. You need to know how to use this. Not because I expect the worst, because a man who does not teach a woman to defend herself has not loved her enough to trust her. That is what my father said to my mother. He taught her with this same pistol in 1859. I am offering you the same lesson. I do not know if I can. You can. The question is whether you will. Yes or no. Yes. Behind the cabin in a clearing where they had set up a split cottonwood round as a target, he stood behind her and showed her how to set her feet. He stood a full pace back from her, his hands hovering near hers without touching close enough that she felt the warmth of him through her wool coat, not close enough to offend. He spoke in short, quiet phrases. Thumb the hammer. All the way back. Hear that click? Good. Now your breath. Out. I see. The pistol knows where to go if you let it. On her fourth shot, she hit the cottonwood. She turned to him with the Colt Navy lowered at her side and her cheeks bright with cold and pride. And Silas Ridge looked at her in the December sun, and a thing happened to his face that had not happened to his face in 11 years. It was almost a smile. It did not quite become one, but it lived there for one long second, amber eyes on her blue ones, and she felt something loosen in her chest that she had not known was tight. Harder things have been survived, Miss Ashmore, he said quietly. You will survive this too. He said it again 3 days later, when she burned her hand on the stove. He said it again a week after that, when a December blizzard shook the cabin like a dog shaking a rag, and she woke in the night frightened and came out to the front room in a blanket and found him sitting up, keeping the fire, and he looked at her and said the same 4 words, and she went back to bed and slept. She began to count the phrases. She did not mean to. It was the Boston habit of noticing the same habit that had once counted stanzas of poetry. A man keeps his word, he would say, when he made any small promise to bring in more wood by noon to be back by dark. Winter always ends, he would say, when the weather pressed down on all of them, when Ephraim's carpentry fingers stiffened in the cold, or a horse came up lame. This is where you belong, he had said to her once softly when he caught her looking out the window at the frozen lake with tears on her face, and he had not elaborated or repeated it. He had only said it and then left the room, and the sentence had stayed with her the way a heated stone stays warm under a quilt all night. A week before Christmas, she did a thing she had not done since Boston. She opened the piano. It stood in the corner of the front room under a faded quilt, and she had never asked about it. She had understood with the quick tact of a well-raised girl that it was not a thing to be asked about. But that morning the sun was coming through the window at a particular angle, and Silas was out on the trap line, and Ephraim was in the barn mending harness, and she was alone in the cabin for the first time since her arrival. And she walked over and she lifted the quilt. It was a small, upright mahogany made in Boston in the 50s. She would have known the maker's stamp anywhere. The petals were brass and the ivory keys were yellowed at the edges, and the wood was dust, grayed but unwarped because the cabin had been kept at an even temperature for 10 years. It had been loved once. It had been silent for a long time. She sat down on the bench. She did not play. She only rested her hands on the closed lid. She heard the cabin door behind her very softly. She had not heard Silas come back. He stood at the threshold in his bear coat, snow in his beard, and she saw his face and she understood at once whose piano this was. I should not have, she began. Play it. Mr. Ridge. Play it, Josephine, please. It was the first time he had used her name. She opened the lid. She laid her hands on the keys. They were cold. She played a scale to feel it, and the tone was clear and slightly flat in the high register, the way a piano sounds after long silence in a dry room. And then she played the Chopin Nocturne in E flat that her mother had taught her when she was 9 years old. She played it slowly because the keys were stiff and because her fingers were cold and because she was frightened. She got to the end of the first page and she could not remember the second, and she stopped. Behind her, Silas Ridge stood very still. After a long moment, she heard him cross the room and sit down in the chair beside the fire and put his hands over his face. She did not turn around. She understood with a woman's understanding that he would not wish to be watched. She played the first page again and again, and on the third time through her fingers remembered the second page, and she played the nocturne all the way to the end. And when the last chord died out into the silent cabin, The only sound was the fire. When she turned on the bench at last, Silas had taken his hands from his face, and he was looking at her. His eyes were dry, but something had been through them. He stood up. He crossed to her. He stopped 2 paces away. That piano has been silent for 10 years, Miss Ashmore. I am sorry. No, you misunderstand me. It has been silent for 10 years. And tonight I am grateful to God that it is not silent anymore. That is what I am telling you. He turned and went back outside. She sat on the bench with her hands in her lap, and she understood that something had just shifted under the snow and the logs and the cold that she would not be able to unshift. The first almost touch came 2 days after that. She was coming back from the woodpile with an armful of split cedar, walking the narrow path between the cabin door and the stacked cords when she hit a patch of glazed ice she had not seen under the new snow. Her feet went from under her. The wood flew up, and Silas, who had been splitting kindling 10 feet off, was there before she landed. His right arm caught her under the shoulder blades. His left hand caught her elbow. He pulled her upright against the front of his coat, and for one suspended second they stood there, his face above hers, the bare coat open at the throat, the smell of him coming off his shirt like pine resin and coffee and clean wood smoke, his amber eyes on hers at a distance of inches, her hand on his chest over the place where she had felt his heart beat through his coat the night he had carried her up the mountain. Neither of them moved. Then he stepped back, very carefully. He held her at arm's length until he was certain she was steady on her feet, and then he let go and he cleared his throat once, and he bent to pick up the scattered cedar. Ice on that stretch, Miss Ashmore. I should have salted it. That was careless of me. I can manage it. I know you can manage it. I should still have salted it. He went inside with the wood and did not look at her, and she stood alone in the cold yard with her hand pressed to the front of her own coat where his hand had been, and she understood that something in her had been waiting for years for a man to catch her when she fell, and that the waiting was ending now in a yard in Colorado at 21 years of age, in a life she had not chosen and had come to want more than any life she had ever imagined. Their first real argument came 3 days before Christmas. Josephine had decided she would go alone to the creek below the hollow to fetch a particular kind of watercress Ephraim had mentioned would make a good dressing for Christmas dinner. The creek was a mile. She felt strong. She wanted for the first time in months to prove to herself that she could do a thing on her own. Silas came in from the barn and found her lacing her boots at the door. "Where are you bound?" "To the creek. Ephraim wants watercress." "Not alone," she looked up at him. "Mr. Ridge, I walked alone in Boston for 3 years. This is not Boston. There is a mountain lion working the south slope. We have tracked her for 10 days. Then I will take the Colt Navy. You will not go alone." "I will." He looked at her, and she saw the thing she had come to know well in him. The old patience he wore over the old anger. He had decided long ago he would never again let out of the cellar. His jaw tightened. He did not raise his voice. "Miss Ashmore, you will do as you please. I will not give you orders in this house, but I am asking you as a man who has buried one woman already to avoidable foolishness to let me come with you. It is a mile. It is a mile in country where something large and hungry is hunting, and you are a person it does not know the smell of yet. An hour of my time, Miss Ashmore. That is all I ask. I did not come all the way out here to Colorado to be kept in a cabin like a child." The words were out before she had thought them. They landed in the room like a dropped plate. Silas looked at her for a long moment. He nodded slowly once. "No, you did not. Forgive me, Miss Ashmore." He took his rifle down from the pegs and walked out. He did not slam the door. He did not raise his voice. He only walked out into the yard, and she heard him pick up the axe, and for the next hour he split cordwood with a steady, relentless rhythm that did not pause once, and she stood at the window and watched him, and she understood at last that a man who has learned never to shout has found other ways to be wounded. She went to the creek alone. She took the Colt Navy. She saw no mountain lion. She came back with the watercress in 90 minutes and her hands cut raw by the ice at the edges of the creek, and Silas was not in the cabin. Ephraim looked up from his book and raised one eyebrow and said nothing. Silas came in at dusk. He hung his coat. He hung his rifle. He looked at her across the room and he said, "Miss Ashmore, you were right and I was wrong. I have no authority in this cabin over where you go or when. I overstepped. I apologize." "Mr. Ridge, no, hear me out. You are a grown woman and this is a free country and I do not own you and I never will. I worry about you. That is the simple truth of it. I am not accustomed to worrying about anyone but my brother. It is a new habit. I am learning it badly." He went to the stove to pour himself coffee, and he turned with a cup in his hand, and he looked at her over it, and he added in a voice so low she almost missed it, "I would be obliged, however, if the next time you go to the creek you would let me know. Not ask, only tell, so that if you are not back in an hour I know which direction to start walking." "Yes, Mr. Ridge." "Silas. Silas." He nodded and drank his coffee, and Ephraim turned a page of his book in the corner with great concentration, and she sat down at the piano and played for the second time, and she was not afraid of the sound of her own music in that cabin anymore. That night, for the first time since her arrival, Josephine Ashmore did not throw the bolt across her bedroom door before she got into bed. She lay there under the wolf pelts and the cream wool blanket, and she listened to the two men moving through the cabin as they banked the fire for the night. Their low voices, the soft clunk of Silas setting his boots by the stove, the snap of Ephraim closing his journal. She did not know exactly what the unbolted door meant. She thought it meant trust. She thought it meant something more than trust that she was not yet ready to name. She thought Silas at least would understand. Out in the barn, in the sweet, warm dark of the loft where he and his brother had laid out their bedrolls, Silas Ridge lay on his back with his hands behind his head, and he did not sleep. He listened to the wind coming down off Wheeler Peak, and he listened to his brother's breathing even out beside him. And he said in a whisper meant only for the rafters and for a woman 10 years dead, "What am I doing, Martha? What in God's name am I doing?" There was no answer. There never was. But for the first time in a decade, the silence that followed the question did not feel like a closed door. It felt like a window left open a crack on a spring morning he had not yet earned, but which was perhaps coming. He rolled onto his side and he slept. 15 miles down the valley in a room above a saloon in Oak Haven, Clayton Rourke sat at his desk with a bottle of rye in front of him and a sheet of paper in his hand. On the paper was a telegram that had just come up from Leadville signed with a single initial. "Arriving Oak Haven, December 27th. 3 of us. Fee accepted. Prepare the lay. B." Clayton Rourke folded the telegram once and then again, and he looked into the fire in the grate of his office for a long time. The first snow of the serious winter had begun to fall outside his window, the thick, slow flakes that promised 6 feet by New Year and closed roads until April in the high country. He smiled slowly, and the smile did not reach his eyes. Up on that mountain, Silas Ridge was keeping a woman. Up on that mountain, Silas Ridge was keeping a ledger. Up on that mountain, whether he knew it or not, Silas Ridge was keeping the rope that would hang half the territory, not for long. The Bannons would come up on the 27th. They would ride 2 days. They would hit the hollow before the new year. They had done this before in Missouri and Kansas in 2 separate mining camps in Nevada. They did not leave witnesses. They did not leave buildings. They did not leave bodies that could be identified without dental work, and there was no dentist in Oak Haven. Clayton Rourke poured another glass of rye, and he raised it to the frosted window. "To a very hard winter, Mr. Ridge," he said softly to no one, "and to the end of a very soft woman. May neither of you see the spring." Outside, the snow came down on Oak Haven and on the mountain above it, and it came down on Ridge Hollow, where a woman had left her bedroom door unbolted for the first time in her life, and it came down on a barn loft where a man had just remembered after 10 years that the dead did not begrudge the living the breath still in their lungs. It came down on all of them, the good and the wicked alike, in that great impartial way of snow, and it kept coming, and the winter that was going to break them all, one way or another, had at last begun. The Bannons did not come on the 27th. They came on the 31st, the last day of 1883, riding up the last switchback in the blue hour before dawn when the mountain was still sleeping and the new snow lay 4 feet deep in the hollow, and the only sound was the small, dry creak of frozen pine boughs. It was Ephraim who felt them first. He had gone out in the half-dark to check a marten set on the west ridge, and he had covered perhaps 300 yards when he stopped on the trail and stood listening. He was not hearing anything in particular. He was hearing the absence of things. The junco that should have been quarreling in the brush had gone silent. The big spruce grouse that held the little meadow was not calling. A ground squirrel that had been cursing him for a week was nowhere. Something had moved through the woods below him in the night that did not belong to the mountain, and the mountain had gone quiet and waited the way a thing waits when the wrong kind of predator comes up the trail. He turned and ran for the cabin. He did not take the trail. He went down the short way through the tight spruce, crashing and sliding, and he hit the back door, already calling his brother's name. "Silas, 3 horses, West Ridge. They are close. They are very close." Silas was up out of his chair before Ephraim had finished the sentence. He had the sharps in his hands and the Winchester thrown to his brother, and he was moving through the cabin with the efficiency of a man who had rehearsed this in his head 1,000 times on 1,000 winter nights. "Josephine, get dressed. Coat, boots, the heavy gloves. Do not bother with the trunk. Everything you need is on your body, or it goes with us in the tunnel. Move, darling. Move now." He did not hear himself use the word. She did. She did not speak of it. She only moved. Ephraim was already pulling up the rag rug in front of the hearth, exposing the square of floorboards that was not joined to the rest, and underneath it, the iron ring and the trap door their father had built into the cabin in the first bad Apache summer of 1861. The root cellar, and from the back of the root cellar, the tunnel. The first shot came in through the kitchen window. It blew out the glass in a white spray and punched into the iron belly of the stove, and ricocheted twice around the room before burying itself in the back wall. Silas was already at the front window with the sharps resting on the sill, and he had seen the muzzle flash from a stand of spruce 150 yards off, and the big 50 caliber rifle in his hands spoke once and rolled its great thunder off the peaks, and a man who had just loaded his second cartridge fell out of the spruce and did not get up. "One," Silas said quietly. "Dynamite," said Ephraim from the other window. "Silas, they have dynamite. I saw the fuse catch." A small black object came arcing through the gray morning end over end, trailing a thread of pale smoke. It landed on the shake roof above the back bedroom. It rolled once and lodged in the valley beside the chimney. "Down," Silas said. "Now." He had Josephine by the arm, and Ephraim had the trap door up, and they went down the ladder in the order they had drilled a dozen times in October, when Silas had begun without telling her what he was preparing for to walk her through the drill. Josephine first, Ephraim second, Silas last. The trap door was still falling closed behind him when the dynamite went. The cabin did not so much explode as collapse upward. The roof lifted and then came down. The back bedroom folded in on itself, and the chimney dropped the full weight of 40 years of Riverstone into what had been the kitchen. In the root cellar, they felt the shock come down through the earth, and the timbers groaned, and dust sifted down into their hair, and Ephraim was already pulling Josephine toward the mouth of the tunnel at the back wall. A square hole faced an adzed pine that their father had cut in 1861, and that no one in the world now living had used except the 3 of them. "Go, go, go!" A second charge went off above them. Something massive came down through the floor of the front room and struck the cellar ceiling, and the beam cracked across its length with the sound of a tree going over in a storm. A piece of it caught Ephraim across the left shoulder as he ducked into the tunnel after her. He went down on one knee with a grunt, like something had been kicked out of him. Silas grabbed him by the back of the coat and hauled him upright and pushed him into the dark, and then Silas was in the tunnel too, and behind them the root cellar came in all together, with a long, slow rumble of earth and broken wood, and they were in the dark. The tunnel went 400 feet. They knew every inch of it by feel. Josephine crawled. Ephraim crawled, one-handed behind her, his left arm pressed to his side. Silas came last, dragging a small bundle of blankets in a canvas sack he had pre-positioned at the cellar end in November because a mountain man prepares for trouble. In the season when trouble is theoretical, not in the season when trouble is at the door. They came out of the tunnel in a narrow ravine behind the hollow in a stand of dead spruce, and they lay in the snow for a long minute listening. Above them, the cabin was burning. They could see the orange glow of it flickering against the gray dawn sky. They could hear men shouting on the ridge. The Bannons had made their charge and were now cautiously working down toward what they believed was a grave. Ugh. I am with you, Silas. How bad? Collarbone, broken, maybe displaced, not arterial, I can move. The Widowmaker. I know, we go there, lead on. The Widowmaker mine was a quarter-mile up the ravine and hidden behind a thick stand of dead blue spruce that their father had, with grim amusement, planted 35 years ago for exactly this contingency. The mouth of the mine was a black, rotten gape framed in weathered timber with a faded sign nailed crookedly to one post, Widowmaker Claim. Property of E. Calloway. Keep out. It had once belonged to a man named Ezra Calloway, whose name Josephine had read in the brown leather ledger. It had not belonged to him at the end. Silas pulled aside the frozen brush. Ephraim went in first, guiding Josephine by her good hand. Silas came last. From the pocket of his coat, he took a brass kerosene lantern he had left hanging on a spike inside the mouth, and he struck a match, and the yellow light filled the first chamber of the mine and showed them a labyrinth of failing timber in black water dripping from the ceiling in a tunnel mouth going down. How far does it go? She whispered. 5 miles of cuts. Most are blind. One exits on the east face of the mountain above the timberline. That is where we are going. And Rourke's men. They will track us in if they have the stomach over it. A mine is a bad place for a man who does not know it. We know this one. They do not. Ephraim, your shoulder. Walks to the top. I am fine. Ephraim was not fine. Josephine could see it in his color by the lantern light. But she had learned already in 2 months at Ridge Hollow that there were things a ridge man said when he was fine, and things a ridge man said when he was upright, and that these were often the same words in a different voice. They went down into the mountain. For 2 hours they moved through the Widowmaker. Silas led. Ephraim walked behind Josephine, one hand on the small of her back, not for support, but so that if she stumbled on the wet rock, he would know before she fell. Silas knew the turns without thinking. He had played in this mine as a boy before Ezra Calloway had been killed for it, when Ezra had let the Ridge boys roam the safe drifts on summer afternoons, and had shown them where the old men had left tally marks on the timber. Behind them, somewhere far back and echoing, they heard the first sound of boots on stone. Silas stopped. He extinguished the lantern. The dark came down on them like a closed hand. 2 men, he breathed. Listen to their step. Heavier one leading. They are 4, maybe 5 minutes behind us. Josephine, your hand on my belt. Do not speak. Do not breathe in until I tell you. When I say down, you go down. When I say run, you run, and you do not stop for anyone behind you. Ephraim. Silas, if it comes to it, I know, brother. If it comes to it, I know. They went on in the dark. Josephine's hand gripped the back of Silas's belt with a strength she had not known she had. They turned right again, left at a pile of old ore car rail, and then Silas stopped them in the pitch black and pressed her back against the cold stone of an alcove, and she felt him turn and face the passage they had come down. The boot steps came closer. 2 lantern beams showed around the bend, wavering on the dripping stone. I am telling you the tracks go this way, Cleet. I am telling you, I do not care which way the tracks go. I want out of this hole. We get the book, we get the girl, we get the bounty. We get out of this hole after. Keep moving. It was the voice of Bo Bannon and the voice of Cletus Bannon, his older brother. The third Bannon, their cousin Eli, had been the man Silas dropped with the sharps out of the spruce that morning, though Bo and Cletus did not yet know it. She understood this even as she pressed herself harder against the rock and tried not to breathe. They came into the alcove passage. The lantern beam swept past, missed the alcove by a hand's width passed on. Josephine held her breath until spots danced in the dark behind her eyes. Silas moved. She did not see it. She only heard it. One sharp, clean sound of something striking something else, wood or bone, and a grunt cut off at the middle. A second sound, heavier, then silence, and then Silas's hand on her arm, very gentle. Breathe, darling. Breathe. A match flared. Ephraim was lighting the lantern. At Silas's feet lay Cletus Bannon, face down, out cold, with a dark spreading at the back of his head, where the butt of the peacemaker had come down. Bo Bannon lay a few feet off his own revolver, still half drawn from his belt, a thin trickle of blood running from the corner of his mouth where Silas's fist had found him. Alive, Ephraim said, bending. Both of them. I want Bo alive. He is the one with the ledger mouth. Cletus we tie and leave. Bo comes with us, bound as far as Silver Cliff. Ephraim, the rope in my pack. They tied Cletus to a timber. They bound Bo's hands behind him with a length of rawhide and gagged him with a strip from Silas's shirt, and they hauled him to his feet, and Bo looked at Silas Ridge with the dull disbelief of a man who had expected to be killing and was now going to be testifying, and he said nothing because he could not. Move, Silas said. East face, 3 hours. Ephraim, you set the pace, your shoulder sets the pace. We do not push past it. I do not lose my brother in this hole today. I do not make promises I cannot keep, and I promised Ma when she was dying that I would bring you home from every fight you ever walked into. I intend to keep that one too. I will not be lost today, Silas, Ephraim said quietly. They climbed. They came out on the east face of the mountain above the timber line at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. New Year's Eve, into a sky so blue and so cold it burned the eye. The wind up there was ferocious and steady, and it drove the snow off the exposed rock in white streamers. Below them, thousands of feet below Silver Cliff, lay like a smudge of smoke against the blue-white plain of the high valley. A narrow gauge track ran into the town from the north, a single black line through the snow, and a locomotive stood at the depot with steam pluming white from its stack. Federal man, Silas said. The train is not a scheduled run. That is a special. Neagle, Ephraim breathed. That is David Neagle. He has come up from Denver. Someone telegraphed him. The operator in Silver Cliff, said Silas. Henderson must have wired when we did not come back down the stage road last month. He must have told Neagle about Rourke. If we are going to live through this. Ephraim managed a smile around his broken collarbone. I told you I was not going to be lost today. They went down off the east face. It took them 3 hours. Ephraim's shoulder was past the point of a man pretending he was, well, the bone grated when he moved. Twice Josephine saw him go gray and sway, and then set his jaw and go on, and she loved him in those moments the way a woman loves a brother she has been given late in life without warning and without deserving it. They led Bo Bannon with them the entire way, and Bo did not try to run because Bo had seen what the Ridge brothers did to men who came at them with dynamite. And Bo Bannon had decided somewhere between the Fourth Timber and the East Face that he was going to prefer a territorial prison in Colorado to the bottom of a grave on this mountain. They walked into Silver Cliff at sundown. They walked past the boarding houses and the blacksmith and the telegraph office with every curtain in the town pulled aside by 2 inches and every pair of eyes in the town on them, and they stopped in front of the Western Union Depot, and they waited because United States Marshal David Neagle had already seen them come out of the East Ravine and was already walking up the boardwalk to meet them. A compact, gray-eyed man in a plain black coat who carried no visible badge and needed none. Silas Ridge. Marshal, you look like you have had a morning. I have had a morning, sir. My brother has a broken collarbone. This young lady is Miss Josephine Ashmore of Boston, and she is, legally speaking, still married to a man named Clayton Rourke out of Oak Haven, who I believe is of interest to your office. This other gentleman is Bo Bannon, formerly of Leadville of Missouri before that, and he has expressed to me a great interest in making a detailed statement concerning Mr. Rourke, the late and unlamented Judge Howlett, and a certain Senator Blackwell in Denver, in exchange for his continued possession of his neck. Marshal Neagle looked at Bo Bannon. Bo Bannon nodded as much as a gagged man can nod. Mr. Ridge, Marshal Neagle said, I have been waiting 2.5 years for this morning. You have just handed me the entirety of the Sangre de Cristo silver fraud ring in one package. May I ask why? Silas looked down at Josephine, who stood beside him, with her face chapped raw by the wind, and her honey hair coming down out of its pins, and her eyes on his amber ones with a steadiness he had come to recognize as her particular form of courage. A man keeps his word, Marshal, he said. I told a woman in a mud street in Oak Haven that she was safe under my roof. My roof burned this morning. The word still stands. Dr. Abernathy set Ephraim's collarbone in the back room of the Silver Cliff Apothecary that night. He gave Ephraim morphine for the pain and a tincture of laudanum to sleep on, and he looked at the wound and said he would be slow for 3 months and sore for a year, and that he would not, in his honest judgment, ever regain the full range of motion in that left arm. Ephraim took the news the way he took all news, which was with a slow, considering nod and no more comment, and he went to sleep in a bed that was not a barn floor for the first time in 2 months. Josephine and Silas sat in the front room of the apothecary that night alone, while Ephraim slept in the back. A coal stove burned in the corner. Outside, the new year had come in with a thin, dry snow, and the streets of Silver Cliff were silent, except for the distant chime of a clock striking 12. He will walk again, Silas said. He will work again. He will read, and he will write, and he will laugh. He will not throw a rope left-handed, and he will not chop wood the way he once did. That is the price of today. I will pay it. I was prepared to pay more. I know, Josephine said. I went into that mine with a list in my head of the prices I was prepared to pay. Do you want to know what was on it, Josephine? Yes. The cabin first. I paid that. My left hand, if it had come to that. I paid most of Ephraim's. His life, if the alternative was yours, I was prepared to pay that. Do you understand what I am telling you? Silas. Hear me out. I am 34 years old. I buried a wife 10 years ago, and I spent 10 years alive in name only up on that mountain, doing the work of a man while I was in truth a ghost. Then a stagecoach rolled into Oak Haven in October, and a woman I did not know was thrown into the street. I pulled her out because of a promise I had made to God a long time ago, but I carried her up my mountain because of something else. I did not know what it was at the time. I know now. I know it tonight. I did not ride out of that burning cabin this morning because of a promise to God, Josephine. I rode out because I could not face a world that did not have you in it. That is the truth of it. I have lived too long to lie about the truth of things. She could not speak. Her hand found his across the table. His scarred fingers closed over hers. I do not expect an answer from you tonight, he said. I am not that kind of fool. You have been through more in the last 2 months than most women meet in a life, and you are owed a long, quiet spring to find out what you want out of what is left. But I will say this to you once, and then I will not press you. You are home, Josephine, for as long as you want to be home. This mountain chose you, and so did I. Whenever you are ready to answer that, or if you are never ready, I will be where I have always been. Winter always ends, and I will be on my porch in the spring. She did not answer him with words. She rose from her chair and she came around the table, and she stood in front of him, and she laid both her hands on either side of his weathered face, and she leaned down and she pressed her forehead to his. Just that. They stayed that way for a long, slow minute while the coal stove ticked and the clock in the square finished striking 12, and the first hour of 1884 came in over the mountains. I have been home since the night you carried me up the mountain, Silas Ridge, she said quietly against his skin. I was only waiting for you to catch up. He put his arms around her waist. She slid down onto his knee, the way a girl sits on the knee of a trusted man. She laid her cheek against the top of his head. Neither of them wept. They had done all their weeping in other rooms on other nights for other people. What they did in the back room of a Silver Cliff apothecary on New Year's morning was simpler than weeping and older than it. They held one another, and the coal stove burned and the snow came down, and somewhere on a mountain 15 miles north, a cabin was a heap of charred timber under new snow, and somewhere in Oak Haven, a man named Clayton Rourke was drinking himself toward an argument he was going to lose. Marshal Nagel took his statement from Bo Bannon the following morning and wired Denver before noon. By the night of January 2nd, Senator Blackwell had been taken from his own parlor in Denver and locked in a federal cell, and Judge Howlett had been taken at the rail station trying to board a train for Canada under another man's name, and a posse of 6 deputy marshals was riding north out of Denver for Oak Haven. Clayton Rourke, warned by a telegraph clerk who had not yet understood which way the wind had turned, fled Oak Haven on the night of January 3rd with a saddlebag of gold coin and 3 changes of horse. They caught him near Cheyenne on the 11th. He did not come quietly. He took one of the deputies in the thigh with a small pistol he had hidden in his boot, and the deputy's partner put a .45 caliber ball through Clayton Rourke's right shoulder. And Clayton Rourke was delivered to Denver in irons bandaged, and with the last of his arrogance bled out on the plains between there and the city. He was tried in February. He was convicted in March. He was hanged on the first warm morning of April in a prison yard in Cannon City with no one to witness it but a priest, a warden, a hangman, and a federal stenographer who wrote down that the condemned had said nothing at the end and had gone quiet and gray. Judge Howlett was sentenced to 25 years. Senator Blackwell, presented with the full weight of the evidence in his cell, on the evening of January 8th, hanged himself with his own belt before the matter ever reached a courtroom, which a columnist in the Rocky Mountain News observed was perhaps the only decent act of his public career. The Widowmaker claim was restored in April to Hollis Calloway, the daughter of Ezra Calloway. She was 23 years old, raven-haired, sharp-eyed, and she had lived with distant relations in Pueblo for 9 years, believing her father had simply vanished. She met the Ridge brothers for the first time when she came up to Silver Cliff in early May to sign the papers, and she was introduced to Ephraim Ridge across a table in the doctor's office. And Ephraim, who had been quiet in a new and more thoughtful way since the mine, looked up at her and stood slowly and said, "Miss Calloway, it is an honor. I knew your father. I was 10 years old when he showed my brother and me where the tally marks were on the upper timbers. He was the first man not related to me who ever gave me a piece of chocolate." She had not expected that. She had to sit down. By the time the papers were signed, she had accepted Ephraim's invitation to tea, which in a Silver Cliff apothecary in 1884 meant hot water with a shaving of sugar stirred in, and by the time she rode back to Pueblo, she had invited him to ride down and see her in June. He did. He rode down with his arm still in a sling and a copy of Emerson's essays in his saddlebag, and he presented her with the book on her porch. And that was the end of Hollis Calloway, living with her distant relations in Pueblo, although she did not yet know it. Josephine and Silas stood on a small wooden platform at the Silver Cliff Rail Depot on the 6th of May, 1884. They were waiting for the noon train down to Denver because Marshal Nagel had asked Josephine to give one final deposition in the Blackwell matter, which was still being wound up in federal probate. She wore a new dress of gray poplin, cut simply with a small cameo pinned at the throat, the same cameo she had worn the day she stepped off the stage in Oak Haven. Silas wore a dark coat and a clean collar, and he looked for the first time in his adult life like a man who had been to town on purpose and not out of grim necessity. The first spring wildflowers were coming up along the tracks. "Josephine." "Yes." "I have been thinking. I can tell you have the expression." "What expression?" "The one where you are going to say something that you have already rehearsed 6 times in the barn." He laughed. It still surprised him, the sound of his own laughter. He had been laughing more these last months in short, unpracticed bursts, as if a muscle long unused was relearning its function. "I have a cabin to rebuild," he said, "by the lake, larger than the old one. 2 stories, a proper parlor, A room with southern light in it for a piano. I would like to rebuild it for a woman I mean to ask to marry me. I would like to know before I drive the first nail whether she intends to say yes. She looked up at him. The mountain wind moved a loose strand of honey hair across her cheek. She smiled, and the smile went all the way up into her blue eyes, and she reached up and laid her hand flat against his weathered face the way she had done on the first night of the year. "Drive the nail, Silas Ridge," she said. "I intend to say yes." The train whistled in the distance coming up the valley. They married on the 21st of June, 1884, under the tall ponderosa pine behind the site of the old cabin where Nathaniel and Rebecca Ridge had been buried 22 years before. The new cabin was not finished. The walls were up, the roof was half shingled, the chimney was a shape rather than a chimney. But Silas had driven the first nail, and he had driven 1,000 after it, and he had decided that he was not going to wait until December to be married to the woman he had carried up the mountain in October. There was no church. There was no organ. There was a circuit preacher from Silver Cliff named Hollings, a dry-kind man who had lost his own wife in the late war and who understood what a second chance was worth. There was Ephraim as best man, his left arm still uncertain in its new geometry, but his smile finally back to the old quiet music. There was Hollis Calloway as Josephine's attendant because Hollis had come up from Pueblo the week before with a trunk of her mother's things and a small cameo of her own pinned at the collar of her dress. There was Agnes Whitaker, who had ridden the long way up from Silver Cliff on a borrowed buggy, who took Josephine's hands before the ceremony and said, "I told you, child, up the mountain, not down the valley." And she laughed and she cried at the same time as old women do at weddings. There was United States Marshal David Neagle, who had come up from Denver for the occasion with a bottle of Kentucky whiskey in his saddlebag, and who stood at the back of the small gathering in a plain black coat and watched the whole thing with the quiet half smile of a man who had done something difficult and seen it come out better than he had any right to hope. Josephine wore a simple dress of cream muslin that Hollis had helped her sew in the 8 weeks before the wedding. She carried wildflowers. Her mother's cameo was at her throat. Her honey-colored hair was pinned up in the style her mother had taught her. She stood under the pine tree in a circle of 6 people, and she said, "I do." And Silas said, "I do." And the preacher pronounced them man and wife in a voice that did not quiver at all. And Silas turned to her and took her face in both his scarred hands, the way a man takes a face he has earned, and he kissed her once softly for the first time. That was all the ceremony they needed. They walked up the half-built cabin steps together after, with the sun going down behind the peaks, and Silas carried her across the threshold of a home that still had no roof, and Ephraim and Hollis and Agnes Whitaker and the preacher and Marshal Neagle sat down at a table under the stars to a wedding supper of venison stew and cornbread, and Hollis Calloway's mother's wedding cake baked from a recipe that had come out of Kentucky in 1841. When the others had gone home to Silver Cliff and Ephraim had gone quietly off to sleep in the lean-to that would eventually become his workshop, Silas walked Josephine out to the edge of the lake in the blue mountain dusk, and he took off his coat and laid it on the cold grass, and they sat down on it together and watched the first stars come out over Wheeler Peak. He did not speak for a long time. Then he said, "I did not know a man could have 2 lives, Josephine. I thought a man got one, and what was spent was spent. I was wrong about that. It turns out a man can have 2. I am grateful to the God I have not always been sure about that I am here to learn it." She laid her head against his shoulder, and she closed her eyes. Behind them in the half-built cabin, a kerosene lamp burned in the one finished room, which was the room Silas had built first because he had known what he was building it for. It had a bed and a window that looked east toward the plains, and a small stove against the inside wall, and a door that could be closed against the night. They went to it together when the stars were all out, and Silas closed the door behind them. Outside, the first fireflies of the Colorado summer come up out of the meadowgrass, and the lake gave back the light of them in small moving points along its still black surface. And somewhere up on the ridge, an owl spoke once, and was answered, and the mountain which had watched many things come and go in its long, patient life, added this to the list and went on being a mountain in the dark. By morning, everything had changed between them, and at the same time, nothing had. They had been theirs for a long while. The wedding had only made it legal. The first spring garden at the new cabin went in the week after the wedding. Josephine laid it out herself in rows in a sunny patch of south-facing ground that Silas had broken up with the steel plow he had bought that April in Silvercliff. Carrots, turnips, beets, bush beans, 3 kinds of squash potatoes, a long bed of hard red winter wheat that would not be ready until late August, and at the far end bordered by whitewashed river stones, a small square for her flowers. Zinnias, marigolds, a single rose bush she had grown from a slip Agnes Whitaker had given her, which had come originally from a garden in Salem, Massachusetts, and which had traveled by way of 6 hands in 30 years from the coast of the Atlantic to this mountain. Silas built her a low rail fence around the garden to keep the deer out of it, and he did it in an afternoon, and he watched her kneel in the dirt in her oldest dress, with her sleeves rolled up to her elbows, and her honey hair tied back in a red kerchief, and he understood for the first time what it meant to be a man who had a garden to protect. Ephraim finished the shingling of the cabin roof by the middle of July, working slowly and carefully with his left arm only half what it had been, and his right arm doing most of the work. He did not complain. He whistled while he worked old hymns he had learned from their mother, and his whistling drifted down through the open windows of the finished cabin in the long summer afternoons, and Josephine came to associate those melodies with the smell of fresh pine sawdust and sun-warmed nails in the particular quiet of that first summer. Hollis Calloway came up from Pueblo in July and stayed the full month of August at Ridge Hollow, ostensibly to discuss the affairs of the Widowmaker mine, which she had inherited and was now legally free to operate. She and Ephraim sat together every evening on the half-built porch of the new cabin, and they talked about books, and they talked about Ezra Calloway, and Hollis wept for her father for the first time in the 9 years since his disappearance. And Ephraim let her weep without trying to stop her, because that was the kind of man he was. By the end of August, they were engaged. It surprised nobody, least of all Silas, who had seen it coming since the afternoon in the doctor's office in May, when his brother had stood up for a woman he had just met and spoken her father's name, with a quiet carefulness that had not been in Ephraim's voice since they were boys. Ephraim and Hollis were married in September in a small ceremony at the Calloway house in Pueblo, which Hollis had inherited along with the mine. Silas and Josephine rode down for it, and Silas stood up for his brother the way his brother had stood up for him 3 months before, and the preacher who married them was the same dry kind Mr. Hollings who had ridden up from Silvercliff in June. Afterward, Ephraim and Hollis came back up to Ridge Hollow together, and Ephraim began the work of building a second cabin half a mile along the lake from the first one on a piece of ground Silas had set aside for him the spring they rebuilt. It took Ephraim 10 months to build that cabin. He built it the way their father had built the first one, which was slowly with care, thinking about every joint so that the thing would stand 100 years. It stood 100 years. It still stands. It is there today. Josephine became pregnant in the fall of 1884. She did not tell Silas at first. She wanted to be sure. She waited until she had missed 2 months and then 3. And then she told him one morning in December when he was pulling on his boots to go out to the trap line, and he stopped with one boot half on and looked up at her across the cabin and did not say anything for a very long time. "Silas, I heard you. Are you going to say anything?" "I am trying to think of what to say, Josephine, that would be equal to what you just said to me." "I am not finding it." She laughed. He pulled on the other boot. He came across the cabin, and he kisses her on the forehead, and then on the mouth, and then he sat down on the floor at her feet and laid his head against her knee and stayed there for a close time, not crying, not speaking, only listening to something that only he could hear. He was on the trap line for 1 more hour that day. He came back early with a pair of marten pelts and a look on his face that Ephraim, who dropped by in the afternoon to bring over a finished coat rack, recognized at once. "She told you." "She told me." "Congratulations, brother." I do not deserve this. Ephraim laid his good hand on his brother's shoulder. Silas, you deserve every hour of what is coming to you, every hour. You are the best man I have ever known, and if the Lord is paying out in kind for what has been spent, you are owed the rest of your life in the sun. Take it. Do not argue with it. Silas did not argue with it. He went to the woodpile and he split cordwood until dark, and every stroke of the axe was a thanksgiving, and every split log was a promise he was making to the life that was coming. And he slept that night with his hand resting very gently on the place where his child was already beginning to be a person. Nathaniel Thomas Ridge was born on the 9th of September, 1885, in the bedroom of the new cabin at Ridge Hollow with Dr. Abernathy in attendance, having ridden up from Silver Cliff the moment a boy from Oak Haven came pounding on his door with the news. The labor was long. Josephine was strong. When it was over and the baby was laid in her arms, a small red squalling thing with a fuzz of honey-colored hair, Silas stood beside the bed with his hat in his hands and his amber eyes shining, and he said nothing for 5 full minutes. Then he said, Josephine, what do we call him? Nathaniel for your father, Thomas for mine. Nathaniel Thomas Ridge. Yes, it is a good name. It's a good, strong name. Welcome to the mountain, Nathaniel Thomas Ridge. He was that year the first child born at Ridge Hollow in 23 years. He was, by the time he was 3 months old, the unchallenged king of the cabin and no one in Ridge Hollow, not his mother, not his father, not his uncle, Ephraim, not his aunt Hollis, who came up twice a week to help, not the aging gelding Hannibal, who had become devoted to watching the baby through the kitchen window, had the heart to tell him otherwise. Ephraim and Hollis's first child, Ezra Calloway Ridge, was born in November of 1886, named for his grandfather. He was a long, quiet, considering baby who looked at the world as if he were weighing it, and who grew into a long, quiet, considering boy, and later into a tall, quiet, considering young man who would, in the fullness of time, become one of the more respected deputy U.S. Marshals in the state of Colorado. Martha Ashmore Ridge was born to Silas and Josephine in the spring of 1888. They named her for the first woman Silas had loved and for the family name Josephine had refused to surrender. And on the day she was baptized in the small new Methodist church that had just been built in a cleaned-up Oak Haven, Silas Ridge stood at the font with his daughter in his arms and his wife at his side, and he could not for a long moment speak the words that the preacher had asked him to speak. Josephine squeezed his hand. He found his voice. Rebecca Ridge, named for Silas's mother, came in 1890. Silas Thomas Ridge Jr. came in 1893, a big, strong boy who was walking at 10 months and talking at 14, and who was the apple of his grandmother namesake's eye, except that his grandmother namesake had been dead for 31 years, a fact which did not prevent Josephine from saying every time the boy did something that reminded her of the portraits Silas had of his mother in a small leather case, "She sees it, Silas. She sees it from wherever she is." Agnes Whitaker died in the spring of 1889 in her bed at her son's house in Silver Cliff, with Josephine sitting beside her, holding both her small, strong hands. She was 81. She had lived to see Josephine married and to see Nathaniel born and to hold the baby twice in her lap, and she told Josephine at the very end that she had done her work and was ready to lay it down. Josephine wept for her the way a daughter weeps, because Agnes Whitaker had been the nearest thing Josephine had to a mother in the 17 years since her own mother died. Silas rode down for the funeral. He stood at the back of the small service in a dark coat with his hat in his hands, and he thought about how the whole of his second life had come up out of the moment that old woman had pressed a handkerchief, embroidered with the letter W, into a frightened girl's palm on a stagecoach bound for Oak Haven. The town of Oak Haven, under Hollis Calloway's quiet and competent ownership of the mine, was not the same town it had been in 1883. The silver keg was pulled down in the spring of '85 and replaced by a proper general store. A school was opened in '87 with Ephraim Ridge as its first schoolmaster, teaching out of the 2-story building he had designed and helped build, his left arm serving well enough for writing on a blackboard and for turning pages and for putting a fatherly hand on the shoulder of a frightened 8-year-old who could not yet read. A Methodist church went up in '88, a post office in '89. By 1895, the town had 300 permanent residents, paved boardwalks, a weekly newspaper, and a reputation as one of the more orderly mining towns in the western slope of the Colorado Rockies. Hollis Calloway was elected mayor of Oak Haven in 1898, the first woman ever to hold that office in Colorado. She served 4 terms. She was re-elected the year women formally won the vote in the state in a landslide that the Rocky Mountain News described with typical understatement as the affirmation of a decade's competent stewardship. The silver from the Widowmaker paid for all of it. It paid for the school, it paid for the church. It paid for the doctor who came up from Denver to replace old Dr. Abernathy when he retired. It paid for the rebuilding of the Stagecoach Road and then eventually for the narrow gauge spur that came up from Silver Cliff in 1901. Hollis Calloway ran the mine the way her father would have run it if he had been allowed to live to do so, which was honestly and carefully, and with a fair wage paid to every man who swung a pick in her service. The years went by the way years do in a good life. Spring, summer, the haying, the first frost, the autumn elk hunts where Silas, his sons, and eventually Ephraim's sons packed up into the high country for 2 weeks and came back with enough meat to see the whole extended family through the winter. Christmas at Ridge Hollow with the piano in the parlor playing and the smell of roasting goose filling the cabin and snow piling up against the south windows. The slow, seasonal breath of a working homestead, which is the breath of any life lived well and close to its own land. Silas and Josephine added on to the cabin twice. First in 1890 to make a proper second bedroom for the children. Again in 1897 when they put on a second story with dormers looking east toward the rising sun. By 1900, the Ridge cabin at the lake was a handsome 2-story timber house with 4 bedrooms, a parlor with southern light in it for the piano, a kitchen with a proper range stove and a covered porch that wrapped the east and south sides. The pine walls had darkened through the years to the color of honey, the way the walls of Silas's childhood cabin had darkened, and the house looked as if it had always been there, and indeed, in a sense, that mattered it always had. Ephraim and Hollis had 3 children in all. Ezra Calloway Ridge, born 1886, the deputy marshal. A daughter, Abigail, born in 1889, who became a school teacher in Denver. A second son, Nathaniel Ridge, called Nate, born in 1892, who took over the day-to-day operation of the Widowmaker mine when Hollis stepped back from it in 1908. The cousins grew up together at Ridge Hollow. Nathaniel and Ezra, a year apart, were the closest of the pack, and they ran the meadows and the woods together the way Silas and Ephraim had once run them, and they built the same forts in the same places, and they caught the same cutthroat trout in the same creek pools, and they grew up into tall, quiet, competent men who did not resemble each other in the face, but who moved through the world with the same deliberate economy, and any stranger who saw them together knew at once they were Ridge men. Silas got older, the way good men get older on mountains, which is slowly with a long, gradual silvering of the beard and a slight deepening of the lines around the amber eyes and a fractional slowing of the step across uneven ground. He chopped his own cordwood until he was 62, at which point Ephraim threatened to break the axe over his knee, and Silas, laughing, handed it over to his son, Silas Jr., and took up a pipe instead. He walked the meadow with Josephine every evening until he was 63, when a bad fall on spring ice broke his right tibia and gave him a limp he would wear in a moderate way for the rest of his life. Josephine's hair went to silver at the temples by the time she was 40, and gradually to white, and her blue eyes did not dim at all, and her hands, which had once been Boston parlor hands, became long and strong and weathered from 30 years of kneading bread and working a garden and lifting children and playing the piano, which she played every Sunday evening for the whole extended family from the day she was 22 until the day the story ends. On a warm afternoon in late September of 1913, 30 years after the Stagecoach had rolled into Oak Haven with a Boston girl of 21, aboard Josephine Ashmore Ridge, aged 51, sat on the porch of the cabin at Ridge Hollow with a knitting project in her lap, and watched her grandchildren chase each other through the meadow. There were 7 grandchildren in sight. Nathaniel, 28, ran the Ridge Hollow cattle operation now, which had grown to a proper outfit of 300 head on summer pasture. He had married a young woman named Sarah Henderson from Silver Cliff, the granddaughter of the old storekeeper, and they had 2 boys. Silas III, age 3, was at that moment being allowed to ride on his grandfather's shoulders across the meadow at a sedate walk, both small fists buried in the great white beard. A younger brother, Thomas, aged 1, was riding on his father Nathaniel's shoulders a pace behind. Martha, 25, had become a school teacher in Denver, like her cousin Abigail, and had come up for the long September visit with 2 small daughters of her own age, 4 and 2. Rebecca, 23, was a student at Bryn Mawr College in Philadelphia, one of the first women in the Ridge family to attend a university back east. And she was not present that afternoon, but she had written a letter that Josephine had in her apron pocket, and it had good news in it. Silas Jr., 20, was spending a year working alongside his brother on the cattle operation before going down to Denver in the spring to take up a clerkship in a law office toward a law degree he intended to earn the hard way. Ephraim, 61, who had been quieter the last few years as the old shoulder finally gave out, what was left of its range came walking up the path from his cabin along the lake with Hollis beside him. Hollis was 52. Her raven hair heavily silver, now still sharp-eyed, still straight-backed. Their oldest son, Ezra, 26, arrived the next day from Denver on 2 weeks' leave from his deputy marshal duties, and he brought with him a new fiancée, a young woman from Grand Junction named Alice, whom Josephine approved of on sight for the quiet, steady way she looked at Ezra when she thought no one was watching. Silas, 64, set Silas III down gently in the grass and crossed the meadow toward the porch where his wife sat knitting. He moved with the slight limp that the spring ice on the woodpile path had given him the year before. His hair and beard were the color of white riverstone. His amber eyes had faded to a softer honey color, but they had not gone out. They had not gone out at all. He came up the porch steps slowly, and he sat down beside her on the bench she had bought for the porch with the first money she had ever made, which was a check from a Boston publisher for a book of mountain essays she had written and sent off on a whim in 1892, and which had, to her continued astonishment, sold well enough to pay for a porch bench and then some. "Josie." "Silas, it is a good afternoon." "It is." They sat in silence for a while. Across the meadow, Nathaniel was lifting his son Silas III onto the back of a very patient old pony and walking the pony slowly in a circle with the reins in his hand, teaching the boy, at the age of 3, the thing the Ridgemen had always taught their sons, which was the balance and the quiet and the respect required to sit a horse well. "Do you remember Josie?" "What?" "The stage, October, 83. "I remember. If you could go back, if you could stand on that platform in Boston the morning you left, and you could have 1 minute to tell yourself what was coming, what would you tell her?" Josephine thought about it. The knitting lay still in her lap. The wind moved a strand of white hair across her cheek, and she did not bother to tuck it back. "I would not tell her anything, Silas. No. I would let her go. I would let her make the choices she made. Because if I changed one of them, I would not have this porch. I would not have you. I would not have Nathaniel or Martha or Rebecca or Silas Jr. I would not have Ezra or Abigail or Nate. I would not have Silas III on Nathaniel's shoulders in the meadow. I would not have any of this. And I would not trade 1 minute of what came to me for a shorter path through. Nor would I. You would not trade any of it. Not the Mud Street Josie, not the dynamite, not the mine, not Ephraim's shoulder, not 1 day of it, because every one of those days is what carried us to this porch. The path is what the path was. I am glad I walked it. I am glad I walked it with you." She reached across and took his hand. His scarred fingers closed over hers the way they had closed over her smaller hand across a table in the back room of a Silver Cliff apothecary 30 years before, on the first night of the year 1884, when he had told her he had ridden out of a burning cabin because he could not face a world without her in it. They sat there that way for a long time while the sun got low behind Wheeler Peak, and the first chill of autumn came into the air off the lake. Ephraim and Hollis came up the steps to sit on the other end of the porch. Nathaniel brought the boys back from their pony circle. Martha called the grandchildren in for supper. Josephine rose slowly, her hand still in Silas's hand, and she looked out across the meadow and the lake and the banshins and the mountain that had taken a frightened girl from Boston and had given her everything. And she said softly, not to Silas, not to anyone, not even to God exactly, but to all of it, "This is where I belong. I have been home since the night you carried me up the mountain. I was only waiting for the rest of my life to catch up." Silas heard her. He always heard her. He put his arm around her waist the way he had first put it around her waist on a dark October road 30 years before, when she had been a broken thing, bleeding against his coat, and he walked her slowly into the house of the life they had built, and the door closed behind them, and the lamp was lit in the kitchen, and the great extended family of the Ridges sat down together to a supper of roast venison and new bread and garden vegetables, and a piano in the parlor played. And outside, the first stars came up over a mountain that had watched many things come and go, but that had, in its long, patient life, never seen a better thing than this. Winter was coming. Winter was always coming. But winter always ended, and a man had kept his word, and a woman had come 2,000 miles on a promise and a lie, and had found at the end of the muddy street not what she had been promised, but infinitely more than she had known to hope for. She had come home, and she had stayed, and she was home still, and she always would be.